Hello everyone, today we talk about population in 6th century Europe, concentrating chiefly on the territories that were encompassed by the Western Roman Empire. So we will actually deal also with late antiquity as well, and more in general with this period of transition, and talking of things between, let's say, actual population and then demographic swings. We're talking about the Justinian plague, and also other political and socio-economical factors in the picture. The 6th century is probably the moment of greater break between, at least it really depends, between the late antique and the early medieval world, right? Every region had its own time of transition. Certain regions changed objectively less than others. That there was a lot of continuity in areas like Gaul, for example, and Spain, up to the Islamic invasion at least. Other areas that really changed a lot, deeply, like Britain, like Italy, and other areas that also had never quite gotten such a high degree of romanization, for which even tracing in terms of sources its demographic dynamics is kind of more complicated, but also because there were objectively less people inhabiting even within the formerly Western Roman borders, right? Think about the Danubian area, or other areas of Germany, for example, that fundamentally had remained relatively untouched by romanization. At least there hadn't been much of a deeply rooted infrastructure that survived over time. In other areas, that there is instead something slightly different. It is essentially a great change, a great modification, but at the same time a great continuity, right? For example, if you take Britain, well, that's one of those provinces that objectively had less romanization than the others, especially certain areas aside from the southeast, that incidentally is also the one from which the Anglo-Saxons began to pour in from. But if you take Italy, for example, that has a brutal and traumatic change during the 6th century, which previously it hadn't had during the migration era, you see that cities, there are many cities that disappear, as we will see now, but also many that remained, right, and maybe transformed within their gates into something different. So the background, the context, is the one of demographic recession, scattered a bit everywhere. Right? We're talking about a trend that actually had been set since late antique times, and that continued, in fact, during the first early Middle Ages, right? Because actually this moment of contraction and or stagnation followed to it is actually quite short in European history, and not only actually. Certain areas of the Mediterranean and the Near East are comparable in this sense, and I would say that in fact this was just a moment of contraction followed by immediate regrowth, right? So actually the Middle Ages, as we have discussed extensively on Schwerpunkt, especially in the medieval society playlist, you can find plenty of this topics discussed, let's say, is that it continued expanding a lot, and actually with a much greater vitality than what the same ancient world had, right? This is particularly important. Late antiquity and antiquity in general dies out, or of course, you can consider the Middle Ages as a continuation of antiquity, as well as it should by certain standards. But objectively, what we call late antiquity is in fact usually intended to have disappeared or transformed into something different in these early medieval times. While medieval civilization wouldn't, like, there is not a traumatic event from which you pass from medieval civilization and then it goes down and starts modern Europe. No, modern Europe is really a direct a direct continuation of the Middle Ages in everything, in its growth, in its expansion, right? So this moment is actually very debated in these terms because, of course, even stressing too much the fact it was that late antiquity and the early medieval world are kind of neatly separated, let's say, is debatable. It's controversial in part also because the general interpretations have tended on average to the pessimistic take, like the negative take on this issue. Like, yeah, there was such a brilliant and advanced civilization, this fell, right? In part, actually, it is true. That's how I also generally interpret it. Like, I don't think that, of course, in less sensationalistic terms, because I think that the ancient world, after all, wasn't this enormous deal compared to what happened later. Like, as we were saying before, the Middle Ages actually were a hell of a civilization in itself that surpassed by certain standards the ancient one quite evenly. And overall, definitely towards the end of the Middle Ages, it was way more advanced complexly. Yet it was different. So certain things are actually not even comparable, because at least you should obviously point out that there were two different contexts with two different within two different systems. So the traumatic moment is the 6th century, especially the second half of it, right? Let's say that everything goes fine up to the Justinian times, that are normally credited as this moment of fracture, chiefly because of the great epidemics that broke out in Eurasia and caused extensive damage, right? Even if I've read things that would try to, let's say, milden the picture, and I think in part it's right, but never. There is a bit of sensationalism attached to these things, like, oh, now we have to dispel the myth that there was a decline. So let's look at pollen from certain areas of, I don't know, Asia Minor or Greece, and let's find out that it wasn't actually, the Justinian plague wasn't that bad, and then you find out that the same study says, they lost 1/10 of the population, and you say, well, yeah, that wasn't traumatic, right? Because you think that losing 1/10 of the population is a normal thing in a prosper moment where where the thing could be absorbed. Of course, this was not the end of the world, right? Most evidently, but you also have to think about the delicacy of these systems in terms of production, and what it meant to lose 1/10 of the population, even for sustaining large areas of this world. Think about the empire, the Roman Empire as such, and what especially this changed at the top, because these weren't very structurally deep realities, right? So even small changes actually were reflected more on the surface, in the sense that the bases were more or less the same, right? So when you lacked even that minimal support, that let's say productivity that allows you a certain surplus, you have either to move or to connect with other channels. It's a real change. It's a big change, right? And there are many areas of Europe at this point, and in fact are cut off from what they had from alpha of a millennium, like in terms of intercontinental trade, etc. That of course doesn't die out as such, but the certain regions are out there on their own, right? And the Romano-Germanic kingdoms are somewhat the proof of this. They start, even politically, institutionally, linguistically, really revolving around themselves, like not too much around the older ideal of the ecumenic empire that was theoretically still there, but more realistically on a regional base, if they were lucky, out of which they didn't manage to come out quite easily. Not even the Byzantine Empire objectively came to do that, because when they lost, the Near East and Egypt to the Arabs, they also lost a lot of projection capability, even if they were objectively the largest power in Europe. And so aside from this, let's just make an example. Let's take Italy. As we were saying before, had remained fundamentally untouched in terms of structural damage to its productive structures since the ancient world. Of course, when I say this, doesn't mean that like Italy in the 6th century before the Gothic War and Justinian plague was, it was like it was in in the 2nd century A.D. Naturally, these lands had lost much of their previous demographic and economical capability. Fundamentally, the Western Roman Empire had fallen when the last Italian resources had been lost with the campaign against the Vandals, actually against the Visigoths and the Vandals eventually in Spain under Majorianus. And that's it. Like, there is no empire, because fundamentally those last resources that took now entire generations to produce, to put again on the table, were exhausted. And there is no empire, because there is no enough surplus to maintain more than just a bunch of German bands of federati out there. And it takes, in fact, the Goths sent from the Balkans to repopulate it, to give an army to Italy, for example. And that's where you get that actually even Ostrogothic Italy had been fairly prosper, right? At that point, nothing had literally gone destroyed. It was just a matter of readapting on different bases, but nothing traumatic, right? So, as we know, instead the Gothic War, followed to the Byzantine reconquest of the Italian peninsula, and the ensuing plague, right, or plague, I don't know how you say it in English, Italian, truth, however, raised Italy to the ground, right? Even Italy was catastrophic, let's say, in this differential change from what it was before and what it was afterwards. Nevertheless, it was still kind of a wealthy place even after that. Like, Italy actually never lost the highest per capita wealth in the world since Roman times to the 17th century. But needless to say, much, but really much, had changed, especially in terms of land distribution. And this was a trend that was eventually sanctioned and consolidated with the Longobard invasion of the peninsula. Then there would be other things to say, but for example, Italy had counted maybe 8 million inhabitants at the beginning of the 3rd century. Well, in the second half of the 6th century, it had lost half of its population. It means that Italians had passed from 8 millions to 4 millions, right? And the same trends are, at least comparable trends are observable also in the rest of the Western, formerly Western Empire. As the empire in the West would have counted around the beginning, let's say at the beginning of the 3rd century, roughly 26 million inhabitants, right? And this is naturally so. First of all, we don't actually know very precisely whether these numbers are correct. Like we don't. These are mostly hypothetic reconstructions, since we don't have but minimally adequate sources to actually know how many people inhabited those places. But the only certainty that emerges from the macroscopic evidence put together by any study now that has been done about this thing since quite a long time now, show a strong demographic decline, right? There is no doubt about this. And as always, it's not just a matter of calculating this kind of scientifically, mathematically, quantitatively, materially, whatever you want to call it. It's really looking at the sources of the time that the documentary sources that actually speak for this decline quite clearly, right? Many are the witnesses, actually direct and indirect witnesses that speak of, especially of cities in ruin, but also of depopulated countryside and of abandoned villages. And after all, of the many hundreds of Roman municipia that constituted the backbone of the empire's population, many of them disappeared in this time span, not to rise back anymore, right? So this is very interesting because, of course, there were cities that survived into the Middle Ages in terms of population continuity. Others wouldn't, right? If you look, for example, always at Italy, some regions, like for example in the north, like Friuli or the Venetian region or Piedmont, well, these were the most exposed to the invasions, and therefore kind of suffered more directly of certain upheavals. I don't know how to say that impacted the population as well. We should be honest about the fact, however, that the northern Italy as the Cisalpine Gaul wasn't essentially very advanced in that regard. I mean, there was definitely a urban net, was well developed, important roads, etc. But Cisalpine Gaul had been less populated than the center and the south of Italy, and instead it would grow after this moment of crisis, let's say, more than the center and the south on the long run for several centuries, let's say. And so this was at the beginning imperceptible, but it would grow to be very evident in I don't know, by the year 1000, for example. There are other areas, for example, in Etruria, south of the Fiora River, where 13 municipalities over 24 disappeared, right? Very interesting sources in this regard are actually the ecclesiastical administration. Italy had a lot of bishoprics and dioceses, say better, and this had been fairly prosperous at the time. We know entire of these disappearing, right? And these weren't just about a church, a cathedral. It was really being about a really territorial population. What is fascinating is the fact that some of these areas wouldn't have really a diocesan organization anymore. I mean, we know, of course, there were bishops scattered in certain areas, but they weren't framed anymore into an organic, precise picture of ecclesiastical organization, and instead other countries had, albeit they had generally less. And this is important because it also reveals that these changes weren't just about they weren't just demographic, they were also political, right? It's obvious that if an area is becomes an area of frontier, like Italy becomes between the Longobards and the Byzantines, especially in the center, in the south. It's very difficult to give a sound centralized government there, and because it's gonna be also always a kind of a disputed land where the countryside, even we will observe this later, is behaving in a different way towards the cities, right? And that is a problem for the previous, whether civil or say secular or ecclesiastical administration, because before those things were mostly the same. Instead, in the Italian peninsula, you find basically that the Longobards occupied the countryside, and the Byzantines retained the coastal cities. So that is quite of a change, right? Because previously, the territorial organization was not like that in Roman Italy. For southern Italy, especially we speak of a real cemetery of cities, right? Between the 5th and the 7th century, many diocesan seats disappeared. Mhm. And this area actually would never, like, at one point the dioceses would pop out like mushrooms in this place, but really not, I mean, without an orderly setting, right? And it was very, very complicated. I mean, there were lands in Central Europe that had just, I don't know, a couple of dioceses in a certain region. In here, you could find hundreds, right? In the lower Middle Ages. So just for giving you a dimensional relation. So consider that these regions in the south of Europe, in the Mediterranean, were still some of the most advanced. Like, Italy had objectively some of the largest cities still at the time. Rome, obviously, in the west, but also within the same. If you consider Italy still being part of the Byzantine Empire, you see that actually some of the largest let's say, Roman cities there were in Italy at the time, and at this point they had been seized by the Longobards themselves. So it's very interesting to observe an area where these this decline doesn't actually correspond to a complete death like in other areas of Europe, where you find that entire cities are literally abandoned and certain regions really literally go depopulated. Here it's more like a change of a different mix, etc. In yet, however, very a complex decline of the population, demographic contraction. There are other factors for sure. We can observe piracy, for example. The Western Mediterranean was surely more present at this point than in the Eastern one. And therefore the coastal centers also suffered of this, but this didn't, however, it contributed to create a sort of hierarchy even of certain centers. Like, for example, in southern Byzantine Italy, in Byzantine southern Italy, you find the presence of certain administrative centers that tend to rise into kind of larger autonomous principalities. That is what basically you hadn't seen in the Roman Empire. In the Roman Empire, there were just lots of cities, and the empire ruled like with politically and militarily in a centralized fashion. And here instead you find a process of decentralization for which certain cities do not make it, or at least they remain subordinated to others, and others keep rising, right? And they will develop during the early Middle Ages into something more compact, more structured, right? And also because there were coastal centers were connected with the Eastern Mediterranean, and they were the point of reference for the empire in Italy, albeit being de facto decentralized centers. But I don't know what to say now. We could let's talk also about the change of the cities from within their own gates. Like the ancient morphology of the urban plan was transformed, right? Normally, for example, the temples and the civic buildings were often reduced to ruins, actually, that were used for taking building material, construction material for new buildings. Certain, like, even for example, think about the collapse of the aqueduct net. That is often seen like that's one of the most evident elements of the decline of the time, a proof that the Romans were so advanced. Now these early medieval imbeciles weren't even capable of using aqueducts anymore. Well, it's not like that. Actually, aqueducts at that point didn't serve too much, right? Because if you don't have enough population, if you don't have enough manpower, what's the point of taking water tens of kilometers away if you can satisfy your drinking needs just with the local stream or river, lake, right? That's important, and that's why aqueducts were also reverted to something else. but also the center of the city shifted in that sense. Because if, for example, if all this plumbing system collapsed, you needed to go leaving where water was closer. So it's obvious that if you see the same Rome shifted towards the northwest during medieval times, because in areas that were swampy and they were often flooded by the river, but hey, they were the closest ones. Now the aqueducts were broken, right? It was more convenient to live in there. Of course, that's kind of worse, but at the same time, you can't pretend the system to work without the same economical and demographic basis that had rendered it possible in the previous centuries, right? And that's why also there were different centers of power that in high medieval times, especially in low medieval times, would evolve on the basis of internal political divisions. Like there were different different centers now. Originally, the center of the city was, of course, the Roman Forum, that often remained as the main square of the city. But now there was also the church, that in late Roman times, before the Christianization of the empire, maybe had been built kind of even outside the city walls. Now maybe were incorporated. It really depends. There are new cities. There is the city of the the roads change, and the centers of the market centers change. So there are different, say, poles around which the urban life starts developing at this point. And on the causes of the demographic decline of Roman Europe, well, we can see that, of course, this was a crisis of the empire altogether, and really a lot has been written about it, and we don't have time now to resume like why did the Roman Empire decline and so on. Not even great lines, because it's really complicated, but certainly it was a complex system of causes, right? It wasn't like main factor. It can't be we can't reason in those terms. To the decline contributed surely external factors, and in part also contingental ones, for which, for example, endemic ones like epidemics, famines, and the invasions of the barbarian peoples. But the demographic crisis was also the effect of new relations that were established between city and countryside. As we were saying before, within those deep transformations of economical and socio-economical, let's say, and political administrative order that interested the empire in the last 2 centuries of its life. The cities that had represented the backbone of the empire, that administrative and socio-economical and partly demographic level, although this last part is kind of, the Roman Empire was an empire of cities, but still, as any other pre-industrial context, the majority of people lived in the countryside, right? So it shouldn't be overly stressed, as if the cities in the ancient world were like something that nothing could beat afterwards. Like, you have to consider, for example, medieval cities on average were larger, and they were much more crowded, by the way. And you could say, oh well, but Rome had 1 million inhabitants in its heyday. Well, yeah, okay, but that was the center of an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Persian Gulf. Like, what do you, is it comparable, like, with, I don't know, Capetian Paris, like, or Republican Venice? I don't know. With that's something different. You can't say like that they were less advanced. Medieval cities were actually impressive in terms of also capability of attraction and expansion, not just of growth, really. So actually, the ancient classical civilization was much less thriving by certain standards than a medieval one, and it tended overall to, especially to decline, as we have observed here. That the medieval one didn't, right? And this is to be considered all the time, because it's not a matter of debate. It's how we know it happened. But around you will find these strange graphs, like saying, talking about alleged, social complexity levels that I don't know how people calculate, making these pictures, like saying, proving that, I don't know, before the Industrial Revolution, the world hadn't reached ancient standards. No, it didn't go like that. Those were reached easily in the low Middle Ages. Right? It took a lot of time. Like, objectively, it did. It took more than, to see the same levels of literacy of Antony in Rome, you have to arrive to 14th century Florence. How many centuries is that? It's like more than 1 millennium. And so it was slow, right? But it was consistent, right? There was a sound base of development that paradoxically was set exactly in this moment of greater crisis, right? And a bit beyond, of course. But it was put in movement with resources that were there in Europe at the time. Now, it would be interesting to analyze this further, like realizing whether, we can't actually speak of this now, but think about the difference that it makes to rule a small area rather than a large empire. Look, of course, much less energies are lost in the process, right? Because we know, physically speaking, larger systems tend to burn more energy that can't be channeled properly in absolute terms than the smaller ones, right? And that's also what was the strength of the Middle Ages, but obviously it's not just like that, right? And the same Roman infrastructures, of course, massively helped the reconstruction, let's say the revival of Europe, European growth in medieval times, right? Never forget about this. That there is objectively, yes, a great continuity also with, infrastructurally speaking, between the ancient world and medieval world. So the cities, as we're defining them now, and entered in crisis for different reasons, various reasons. For example, think about tax pressure, right? This is no joke, right? This is not a a political statement. It's really realizing that many populations, and we know this, especially in the 6th century, after during the crisis, were fed up. Like, they couldn't sustain, suffer more than much. Literally, they preferred to escape, for example, Byzantine lands that had a very high fiscal pressure, seemingly, even into Lombard areas in Italy, for example. Talking about Italy because it's this area, let's say, in between what was still the Roman Empire and the let's say Germanic Europe, or at least Latin-Germanic Europe. Great changes were under this point of view also in. I'm not aware actually whether this happened in the Balkans as well. That the Balkans got Slavicized heavily. The Slavs poured everywhere. We think that some of them even took the sea and that they arrived into North Africa in small groups, etc. And I'm not aware of people escaping like Byzantine land to join kind of Slavic communities, but this was a real story, for example, with the Germans in Western Europe. And we have a lot of proof of this, which naturally is not just about being inside a Roman Empire, but at that point being in a foreign empire, like that's this. For example, those Italic populations were fleeing into Lombard territory, were considering the Byzantines now as something different from the Romans, right? Not institutionally, not juridically, but something like a foreign domination. In part, of course, others wouldn't think like in these terms, but there was this speaks for that differentiation, especially between the city and the countryside, where you can find it literally at this point. Now we're making an example about the cities properly, and where this happened as well, but in the countryside it was present too, of too heavy taxation, right? that literally made people fleeing. And when I talk about taxes here, I'm not talking about paying the little tax for normally just being free. We were talking about a heavy interference in administration and settlement generally speaking in the control of the territory and its populations that were squeezed, right, and exploited to levy money, right? Because also the great problem of these empires is that we often forget is that they objectively needed a lot of resources quickly, right? This is not even a fault. You can't say the Byzantines needed heavy taxation because they were the Byzantines, because they were greedy, I don't know, or something like that. They were simply doing what old empires did, by the way, with administrative structures that allowed to enact such form of taxation. Because, for example, the Longobards had more problems to do that, for example, because they had to build something from scratch, right? They didn't even have a kingdom at the beginning properly. So this is really a problem of seizing as much as you can for coping with threats that are objectively pressuring, and they don't leave any political entity here enough breath to go on freely and functionally. So it's really a big deal. It's really a big problem, and it was deeply felt even. So, in general, I was just thinking about this thing of the taxes because really, yeah, everybody did it, but the problem was also having these structures, the administrative structures to render it possible, right? And the problem of authority here is great because Latin-Germanic Europe doesn't have a big deal of centralization, right? For example, the Arabs, when they invade Spain, they're able objectively to create a consistent territorial domination. Like there is a lot of debate whether this was actually such an advanced area, like some say, or whether this was oppressive. It gets also very political, I suspect, today. To judge, I personally don't know. I can't say. I've looked something into Arab Sicily, for example, and that was surely not an enormously advanced thing, as it was said at some point. But that was Aghlabid Sicily. Like it wasn't like a massive regional power like the Umayyad Spain, right? But the concept here is that out of, in fact, of Umayyad Spain and Byzantine Empire, there was nothing like centralized at those levels, at least, in the rest of Europe. Really nothing. There are sound dominations. For example, it's interesting that those areas that would start to function kind of better over time would be the same Longobard Italy, and in part also Anglo-Saxon England, albeit a bit later than this, while other areas took like a privatistic direction, like the broader Frankish Central European area didn't quite understand what it meant to have a public authority as such. Like they knew the value of arms, let's say, but in terms of a centralized administration, it was like zero. Like, okay, let's not exaggerate, but in comparison of these other areas, of course, and Clovis had attempted something at the beginning, but these structures had vanished, and the Carolingian Empire would be based largely on a privatistic level. They would try to substitute something like engaging more the church, etc., but we know what was the end of the Carolingian Empire at the end of the day, albeit it changed also other things that eventually resisted up to now, if we can say that, especially from a cultural point of view. But aside from this, the decline of the city, like why did it happen? Like, of course, if you consider the broader decline of cities as trade centers, like imagine this enormous intercontinental trade at one point being exhausted by the plague across Eurasia and this demographic exhaustion. Okay, the city objectively loses importance because it had lived out of those traffics in substantial part. So the countryside here seemingly gains more importance. Also, for example, the city was normally targeted by foreign invasion, right? Taking a city was the major strategic goal of a power at this point. There were a few cities, but these larger ones that had survived objectively were really more imposing than before, right? Even just as literally as infrastructures, like now even siege warfare has somewhat contracted into simpler form, so it was difficult for an army in early medieval times to storm a city, right? It didn't quite happen, and especially, yeah, in Southern Europe you find something like that, but for example in Central Europe, in Northern Europe, well, in Northern Europe almost weren't basically cities at that point, but there are obviously different levels of let's say of urbanization as such. Um, but of course, the sieges were practiced, and the way normal ways a city would fall was by someone opening the gates, as it mostly happens during medieval times, actually, because there weren't many other means to take a city at that point. Not many convenient ones. So cities were also looted. Think about peoples that were crossing that simply needed to go settle somewhere else, and that relied chiefly on loot, like raiders, etc. Well, they needed this stuff, right, to eventually settle down somewhere and sedentarize. But at that moment, getting a lot of wealth, right? Think about the sacks of Rome by the Visigoths and Vandals, etc. They weren't very destructive, telling you the truth, but that it was aimed at seizing precious metals fundamentally. They tended to be treasured, and cities became also this, of course, in that point. But they had always been. But let's say that their character was reinforced in, let's say, as places of central power, right? It's not that the city augmented, as we have seen. We're talking about a decline, right? But at the same time, those cities that survived usually were something that, in relative terms at the time, were kind of very imposing, right? And the destructions that hit many urban centers were in particular the one of central and northern Italy and of Gaul, right? Albeit, as we have seen before, these two areas especially had a capacity of revival. Objectively, Gaul and Italy were the richest countries at this point. They, even if in different terms, like Gaul was the really the big thing. Like Gaul was immense, was fertile. Much of local Roman production systems had remained intact. It was in in the 6th century, the richest country in Europe, in Western Europe, let's say better. In Italy was, as we've said before, the richest country per capita. So this was something different, which meant that the average. This was also a matter of, however, wealth distribution, right? It was a matter of who still detained riches, and the fact that Gaul had a lower per capita wealth than Italy, but still being the richest country in absolute terms, is speaks for the political and social stratification of Gaul in general, not just Francia, but also the south, and because it was more similar to the ancient Roman latifundium system. It was somewhat similar in Spain as well, right? In Italy, instead, the latifundium had vanished, right? So many peasants had objectively re-seized their own possessions. The Longobards helped this in part. The Goths had already done towards the end of the war. They had freed all the slaves and this stuff. So, but that's another story. But just for explaining to you how certain particular indicators do not necessarily have to do just with one factor, of course. I don't think you're idiots, but sometimes it's interesting to point out how the various implications of this. Um, so it's not surprising that since the mid 3rd century, almost all the cities of these of Gaul and Italy specifically that were also the most targeted by the Germanic peoples began to build, for example, new walls, right? And they abandoned certain quarters, as we were saying before, that were more populated, and they shifted towards other areas of the city, right? And in other areas of the European part of the empire, there was also the strong resizing of the manufacturing activities as a consequence of the um, economical development of the Roman cities of Africa, for example, right? Africa, like, which is roughly today's Tunisia and eastern Algeria, was pretty damn advanced at the time, in late antique times, and it had started to become concurrent to with parts of Europe, and also its loss definitely favored, and if not determined, largely the fall of the Western Roman Empire, right? Its loss to the Vandals specifically. For example, in almost all the centers, the urban tissue lost compactness, right, for the progressive loosening of cohesion between the city and the dependent territory, right? That weakened the administrative function by increasing in proportion the weight of rural society. This is important because it means at that point that, of course, with loss of centralized direction, let's say, of the empire, the local authority had also progressively vanished. So the country communities had retaken part of their autonomies. This had weakened the cities that the city exists because there is a countryside, right? Even if the city can be a great trade center, can be a marketplace, a manufacturing center, but it still exists because there is a countryside that brings supplies to it, right? Largely, that's why a city exists, right? And that's why you see cities growing in these times, especially in ancient medieval times. In modern Europe, transatlantic trade and colonies began to change something in that matter. It's always because the countryside is growing, right? And there is enough surplus to maintain the structure. Many aristocracies had also abandoned the city. Like when we think about the Roman aristocracy, we think about landowners that had the villa in the countryside, but they were fundamentally urban citizens. They lived in the city. They had their administrative functions there, etc. In early medieval times, take the typical European lord is a landed lord that lives in the countryside, right? He can't even arrive to the city and deal with the city. Of course, they always did it, but they fundamentally were countrymen. This is important because many speak also of a sort of lack of commitment of the Roman elites that got corrupted and weak and lazy. Well, this is kind of a very ideological statement. If the city declines and you don't have the money and the means to organize it, to organize the empire from there, why would you keep living the city? It's obvious that you start investing in countryside, and that's not a way to make the ancient system fail. On the contrary, it's a way to reorganize it on kind of sounder basis. And this is how many realities went on, right? Without remaining attached to a model that didn't serve anymore. You need money to make things work. If you don't have them, if you insist in something that is doomed to fail, why do you keep going on? So the lack of commitment because of an alleged moral corruption of costumes, it's utter garbage. But it's still important to realize that the city lost in this way also further importance, right? In certain areas of urban tradition like Italy and southern Gaul that also were dramatically similar. Let's say changes never went upside down. Like the traditional relation between city and countryside never quite came to an end like as it was before. Um, in other areas, especially in Germany, in northern Gaul, in Britain, northern Spain, etc., the situation is that really the rural world took over, became prevalent as in terms of political and socio-economical weight. Mm. We should remember, however, that the demographic crisis of the cities didn't mean an increase in the population of the countryside, right? On the contrary, also in the countryside, for example, tax pressure was strong. The lands left empty, the so-called agri deserti in Latin, so literally deserted fields, according to the actual terminology of Roman administration, widened largely. You know that the Romans had made a lot in terms of deforestation, of reclamation, etc. They had really kept certain areas dry, workable, and at this point, these infrastructures were impossible to be sustained. So many areas came back to be flooded, and the forests took again their own space, right? So this naturally contributed to a in part, of course, of our further ruralization of society, and kind of even the expansion of these rural country communities into the world of the forest. Maybe before more than there had been before. There is not a linear process, right? This thing happens also in the 14th century when the plague hits and a lot of forests re-expand, right? But it still goes largely at the expenses of the let's say of the agriculture as such, right? So there are really different models of life that are being to which some communities reverted to, and from centuries of let's say of different lifestyle, right? And this happened especially during the 4th and the 5th century. Right, so this was a change that had already happened by the 6th century in many areas, but of course it kept increasing. And there was the attempt of, as a consequence, to tie from the Roman emperors to tie by law the peasants to their land, and they were largely unsuccessful. Even the repopulation of more or less deserted areas with the Pacific settlement of Germanic populations, like it happened in 4th century for the north and the east of Gaul, didn't have many practical effects in this regard, right? When we think about the Germanic populations settling in Western Europe, we don't have to think of actually people that were faring particularly better than the areas they conquered, like or where they simply settled. They lived in a pretty hellish situation on the frontiers, exposed to other peoples, other raids, and continuous warfare. A very few local productivity, like the Romans didn't give to these peoples the wealthiest lands, right? The most fertile lands. Those kept them for themselves, also because it was easier, given that they were mostly around the Mediterranean. Instead, these areas were mostly in Central Europe. Then, of course, at one point, the Germanic peoples even settled in more Romanized areas without permission. But that was mostly a matter of, say, military garrisoning of the frontiers, rather than actual transformation of the Germanic warrior into Roman peasants, right? So, in fact, these communities would maintain a kind of militarized character. On Schwerpunkt, we never discussed very in detail this phase of late Roman. Like, when did the Limitani, what about the Roman units that were scattered all over the empire when the empire formally fell, right? Many of them remained and were also absorbed by the local Romano-Germanic administration. We know it. Think about Britain, for example, that was left like with a Romano-Brythonic government about which we know basically nothing, but we know it was there. We know it attempted some resistance at one point, but there were also many, to the Anglo-Saxon invasions, but that is also very dramatic history, telling the truth. We know it because we see British land borders, like agricultural repartitions, being completely altered. So we don't know what happened, but we're surely that whatever it was very, very, very bad. Like, it was rough. That there was it was not because of the Anglo-Saxon invasions. Actually, it was literally a sort of revolution of local revolts that brought these, and that speaks for the weakness, for example, of the city centers that at that point had controlled Roman Britain, and that now evidently couldn't withstand the pressure of the country. But aside from this, there were, for example, another proof that the same Roman emperors actually didn't want to settle the Germans who were becoming peasants. In certain cases, of course, it happened as well, is that law forbade marriages between Romans and barbarians, right? Obviously, it was a failure because we can't think it. It makes no sense, but of course this was not about literally the single Germanic warrior that wanted to get married with the local Roman woman. Here we're talking about trying to preserve an entire community as deputed to a certain role that was mostly the one of a military colony. So it's obvious that by settling down, these populations would substantially turn to the land themselves, but at a point where they would take over like the whole thing, and the central authority couldn't regulate it in any way. The same can be said in all those barbarian military colonies that were installed to strictly military defense. In fact, in all the parts of the empire, in Italy, in Gaul, in Spain, in Illyria, right? These were communities that fundamentally ended up to mix with the local populations. And they weren't probably even that numerous okay, we'll discuss about this later, actually, about this specifically now, because between the 5th and the 6th century, you see these waves of invaders that surely messed up further the population of Western Europe. In fact, many people think, okay, well, these people fundamentally repopulated these areas. Well, it's not that easy, right? Of course, they contributed to elevate the demographic levels. But if we look at the proportions, especially with the more populated areas of the empire, overall, they didn't change much. The Visigoths that sacked Rome in 1410, and that after certain events would settle in Aquitaine, didn't count more than 100,000 people, between warriors, women, children, slaves. The Vandals that crossed the Gibraltar Strait, invading Africa, were, at least calculating the number of boats that they used to cross the strait, barely 80,000. And not very different was the consistency of the Ostrogoths that settled in Italy at the end of the 5th century, bit more than 100,000 people, 1/4 of which were warriors, while the the contribution of the Longobards was somewhat larger. They arrived between 568, 69. Even other waves came later on, and they were, I mean, like they're generally considered like a lot of people. Also, not just the Longobards, many other nations technically, but we think they were 100,000. Some say 300,000. So this would vary essentially between 1 to 3% of the Italian population, right? And of course, it is true that certain areas were kind of more impacted by these migrations than others, right? It's obvious that many lands had gone depopulated. Think about the Slavs. The Slavs expanded on an enormous amount of territory that at that point had been left empty by other peoples that had inhabited those areas since centuries, right? So they came, and that changed literally the ethnical geography of Europe, because if you settle in one land where there is almost no one, well, and you are kind of a lot of people like the Slavs were, but that changes a lot who they are, the people who live in that area. And it's interesting, in fact, to study even the various different settlements and settlement centers that these populations followed. Like, there are, of course, in all these lands of Western Europe, certain specific, even around particular cities or certain plains. We know, even just genetically speaking, there is more evidence of certain groups rather than others. And that's obviously the consequence of these migrations at that time. So let's say the negative demographic effects of the barbarian invasions didn't compensate, but in minimal part by the settlement of the conquerors, right? The tradition that forbade the mixed marriages was maintained mostly in the mostly Romanized areas, kind of slowing down maybe the fusion between the populations, but I personally think in general it didn't have almost virtually any impact. Like, many people believe still in I should make it like a 4 hours video one day to explain this, because there are so many stories that are told according to all the historiographical cliches, just because there are very few people who study these things that, however, have already demonstrated that it doesn't make sense. As you know, I had the opportunity to study just a bit, Longobard history specifically, and that's also why I speak often about them, and I made a playlist dedicated to them. For example, there is this myth that for example, in Italy, the integration between the Longobards and the Latins was slowed down by even by a late conversion of the Germans to Catholicism, because they were Arians. It doesn't make sense at all when you look at these things. You have to think. I see it in this way, personally speaking. First of all, this is all political, right? Before cultural or religious, and this means simply that there are certain elites that sustain a certain ideology, actually to back certain political, let's say, certain dynamics of control of land, locally speaking, right? Because let's be honest, now it got down only to land, right? But this is elite. This is political propaganda. The majority of people simply settled, and this is paradoxical because we know that we have somewhat this idea that I don't know, the Germans were just these terrible conquerors that arrived and they started oppressing everyone and making slaves, the Romans. It never actually worked like that. They didn't have, as we have seen now, they didn't have the demographic strength. What do you think they could do, honest? They needed the local population, and they started mixing immediately. And paradoxically, it was exactly in those areas that were more Germanized, because there was less local population, that we know actually from archaeological evidence, so from literally like normal people most of the times, that I mean, not necessarily normal, but in the sense of of actual evidence of how people lived at that point, that the cultural resistance of the invaders to the local was like zero. Right? Of course, they brought their own part of their own culture, but they immediately assimilated the other one. You can see it, for example, the Alamanni. When the Alamanni invaded they occupied the Agri de Cumatas in southeast, would be today's Swabia, roughly, Switzerland, parts of France. They settled, like we know, for example, that Germanic women immediately started dressing like Roman ones, right? It is especially women that pioneered this, especially these like also local relations. We know it happened also very high social levels. Like there was a it sounds kind of stereotypical, but literally women were engaged much more in this social representative ways to cope with local populations and this neighboring relations, right? And actually, because the Germans themselves attributed to women such a great importance to also solve matters that in a kind of a sensible fashion, not just with a sword, like with a spat, and also because many of them also remained there, with their men going to fight out there, even in other countries, and it was a real problem of literally controlling the territory. And it seems like this is very overlooked every time we conceive what the difficulty of controlling a territory and its population in the 6th century are immense. So we can't presume that these guys arrived and started ruling with iron fist. They didn't mix because they thought they were, but no, it immediately happened. And we have the actual archaeological evidence of this. And all this matters, for example, Arians versus Catholics. That was a purely political problem. It was not a cultural problem. People culturally blended immediately, right? And in the case especially of, most of the Western imperial lands are Romance areas, right? So they remained essentially Latinized, right? So we talk about Italy, France, Spain. Well, these were all areas where the Germans settled in, still speak a Romance language, with all the differences of the case, and of course natural and evident Germanic evidences in the vocabulary, even in the appearance. And so it's not so we don't have to think it so dramatically every time. In stressing these cliches that there was this great resistance to, and if anything, it probably were the Romans that were more distrustful of the Germans, like culturally speaking, than vice versa. But of course, also the Romans Germanized in part. That is what is very interesting, right? There were certain areas that were fully kind of Romance at one point, but still they had a purely Germanic political culture. It's the case of Longobard Italy, for example. The Longobard kingdom never winked at the Byzantines like the Franks or the Visigoths did, like for feeling included in the Roman Commonwealth. No, it didn't happen like that. They felt they were Germanic. They were the Longobards. Their horizon, God-given horizon, was to conquer Italy. Point. They didn't need anyone telling them what to do in that regard, and they were evidently Romanized because they wrote in Latin. They had a legal culture that evidently they were also influenced by the local Roman elites, but they were essentially German, and the Italian population thought of themselves as Longobards at that point, which is amazing, and that's why many people like many scholars still up to a few generations ago said, these Longobards must have enslaved all the Romans in Italy, because we don't find any Roman in these sources. Well, thanks my eyes, they were all Germanized. They were all Longobard, juridically speaking, that had already blended, and you don't need a direct evidence because these things happened normally. It's obvious that a freeman stayed there, like a Roman citizen was. Like, you could be considered, like, theoretically a half freeman because he was subjugated by the conquerors, initially speaking. But we're talking about 1 to 3% of the population conquering the, like, 98, 97. What do you think that you don't find a name of Romans in Longobard Italy that because at that point everybody was Longobard. Like, you find actually Roman names, but I mean you don't find actually Roman. Here it's complicated because the ethnic identity at that point was mainly juridical. So you don't find anybody who appeals to the Roman law. It was, by the way, forgotten in Italy, but just to the Germanic edict of Rotary, right? And so, okay, but if you go into the Longobar, if you're interested in this stuff and you want to look more into it, I made something, you go in the Longobar history playlist, you find as much as you want about this. And we will have to talk about it more at one point. So here we are in time of coronavirus, and we we have to remind the fact that between the 5th and the 6th century there was this revival of epidemic illnesses. So I admit I don't understand much about epidemiology in any form. I just presume that there are just a lot of hypotheses about what the nature of these illnesses actually were. It seems that the bubonic plague made its first appearance in Western Europe around 442 AD. But as we know, but because I thought it was actually smallpox, like Justinian's plague, right? Justinian pandemics. That is the one that struck Eurasia, actually, not just Europe, in 547, right? In full Gothic War. And in fact, this is this was tied to the Byzantine conquest of Italy under Justinian, and so that decline and stagnation of European population and economical growth, etc., in fact happens exactly in the 150 years that started afterwards, from there on, right? And were characterized by several epidemic waves that could have like a small as well as large scale. And the most hit areas were definitely Italy, of course, southern Gaul, and Mediterranean Spain. That is exactly those regions that maintained more commercial contacts with the Byzantine East and were the main centers, endemic centers of the illness, seemingly were located. So it's following the commercial routes that the plague arrived to hit the valleys of the Loire and the Rhone and Rhine rivers, and even Britain and Ireland. Which means, by the way, that these areas were of course interconnected and not cut off from the rest of the world. Which means there was still some contact. Of course, this happened before the effects of the same plague, but these contacts never ended. Like we don't have to think that early medieval times were a moment where nobody traveled, where nobody knew about the rest of the world, where intercontinental traffics didn't exist. They always existed. They had just been resized, but that's pretty much it. They were still there. And next to the plague, there were other contagious illnesses that spread in various parts of Western Europe. For example, leprosy, like written sources especially witness, but especially the examination of certain rests of human bones that have arrived up to us show, in fact, smallpox and tuberculosis. Right? And think about even what certain areas of this world should be like. In the coastal plains of the Mediterranean, the environmental decay had originated um, ponds and swamps, and this spread favored the spread of malaria, for example, that would remain there for even very, very like up to the last century in certain cases. So, as you understand here, a lot of continuity and discontinuity in dynamics that are comparable, like with others that had already happened, would have yet to happen, and that are still happening in part. Just thinking about how epidemics affect our world and how they can really make a great difference overall. And alright, so I think for today we can stop here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.